Yes, it is. It's automatically entered.
Good morning. Welcome, and I'll have a little bit of housekeeping to go through in a couple of minutes. Just make sure we'll leave it for one more minute, see if anyone else is joining us. Thank you for having it on mute. We are recording. Right, this is a fairly big session, so to make sure we stay in time for you, I am actually going to start. People can continue to join us. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Vicky Stableford, and I'm the NTHA Member Workhouse Safety HR Manager, and I'll be your host for this free workhouse safety session. Before we begin, just a quick note. Today's webinar is being recorded, as I just said, and for those who just joined us, this will be available for future viewing, so you can revisit the content later. We'll also make sure we share the slides and the handouts that we'll discuss today, and you can revisit this content at any time. There's no need to feel pressure to write everything down, so that's why we make sure you actually get a copy of everything. Someone else is coming in. You're welcome to have the screen off, so thank you for doing that, and also keep yourself on mute. And I have very pleased to introduce our speakers that you can see, the three of them sitting out the front. So we have Keenan Smith, our lawyer from Hamilton Lock in the middle, Michael Driver, the ITO National Primary Demand Manager, and Steve Swinney-Ryan, our ITO National Safety Manager. So a little bit about the content that you're about to understand over the next 2 hours that we'll be covering, and that is a powerful first-hand account of a workplace tragedy and what could have prevented it, a practical overview of workhouse safety legal obligations and what's expected of you as a business owner, as an officer or a worker, how to identify common risks and apply simple controls to keep yourself and your team safe, an introduction to a free workhouse safety toolkit app filled with customised tools and to keep yourself safe. By the end of this session, we know you will walk away with practical knowledge, tools and resources ready for use. And obviously about a bit more compliance in your workplace and to keep yourself and strengthen safety for your workplace. We're going to try and keep questions and answers to the very end. So we really value your questions. So please write them down. Feel free as they come to your mind to put them into the chat box. And that way we can stay on track and we will give you some time at the end to have those questions answered. So yeah, please put them in the chat box and we'll address as many as we can. Overall, just going to transition now to the speakers. So we want to get started and keep us on track. I'm actually going to hand you over to Michael Driver, who will go through their story. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Vicky. Sharing is full screen. Oh, yep. Awesome. Okay, so thanks, Vicky. As Vicky said, we're just going to go through, I guess, our story first, and then after that, we'll go hand over to Keenan. Keenan's going to talk to you about all things fun in OH&S law. And then at the end of all that, we'll go back and have a look at some of the tools and so forth that we created and some of our key learnings and share some of that with you as well. So it all really for us started on the 1st of February 2021, where just after midday we had a workplace accident, and John Cook and Sons, part of the ITI group. So I walked out to the yard and it was pretty evident that this accident was a fatality. And that was the day that I guess a lot of things changed for us. So we had the police investigation. Within about 5 minutes, we had 20 police officers on site. New South Wales Ambulance Service, New South Wales Fire Brigade, Toll Rescue Helicopter, and then later on that day, SafeWork New South Wales. Throughout the police investigation, obviously we're all interviewed over about a 16-month period, and 16 months later, our forklift driver was actually charged with manslaughter. SafeWork New South Wales commenced their investigation throughout that same period. And we thought we had 2 years before we'd heard anything. And 2 years, one day we reached out and hey, we haven't heard anything, and or our lawyer at the time informed us that something had been filed in the court. So what had happened through that journey, we got issued a 155, and a 155 is a question, a series of questions. There was 167 questions in total, 8 to 10 sub questions within each of those questions. And it's a bit of a evidence trail that we have to put together to give to SafeWork. And what that evidence trail did was, I guess, allow SafeWork to determine our gaps and lay charges against us. And Keenan will go through those charges a little bit later. Obviously, you've got a team management and the welfare to take care of. You know, everybody gets impacted very differently by what's happened in the operations. You know, the 1st of February every year, I make sure I spend the day in the yard with our guys and make sure that everybody is supported. Workers' compensation implications, obviously financial implications to the business, you know, managing different return to work programs for each of the people impacted. Business interruptions, you know, we went into a voluntary close down period. The accident happened on a Monday. We went into a voluntary close down period for that week. We then closed multiple other times over the next 12 months, whether that be for the police reenactments or SafeWork investigations. We had surveyors in taking gradients and so forth. And we just thought it was better to close so the team didn't have to go through it again. One of the biggest interruptions that we had, I guess, is that our forklift was taken for about 2.5 years. And our CCTV system was taken for about 3.5 years. So the police took our forklift and then shared that, I think, after about 12 months with SafeWork, and then SafeWork had our forklift. And we only got the CCTV system back about 6 months ago. So that was a massive cost to the business. I think it cost us about $40,000 just to replace the CCTV system. But more importantly, there was a family out there without a father, without a husband, and a business to run, and yeah, 3 beautiful young girls and a young 13-year-old girl at the time who had to step up and start running the family and the family business. So I'm going to share a video with you, and then when we come back, we're going to start exploring things within the OH&S law.
There are many great things that fill our lives with meaning. Our family, our hobbies, and even our community. We go about our daily routines, following our usual pattern, just as if we're on autopilot.
This was the day that everything changed. It happened so quickly. I've driven forklifts my whole life and I'd never thought this could happen to me. All it took was a moment. Parked up on a slight slope, didn't put a chock behind the rear wheels. Jumped out for just a second to label some packs. The forklift tines were still up, but I'd parked with the wheels pointing down the slope and forgot to put on the handbrake. And then I realised that silently my forklift had rolled away.
Mr. Singh was crushed between the back of the forklift and the truck. His injuries were fatal. So many things could have been done differently that day to prevent this tragic event from happening, to prevent so many lives and families from being impacted by it. Every business owner and operator should be vigilant about asking themselves these questions every day. Are my systems sound? Do I have procedures in place? Have I provided effective training that staff know how to follow? Are they adequately supervised? Am I checking that they're following procedure consistently? And can I demonstrate adequate due diligence? Because it can all go so very wrong, so very quickly if we don't.
We've always known that we have a legal duty of care, and even with the charges being withdrawn, this tragic incident has served as a further and ongoing reminder of how important that duty is. Apart from the obvious trauma of having someone sustain fatal injuries on our watch, We had to shut down the business, and that was very hard on everyone, emotionally and financially. It's been incredibly tough for those in leadership. Myself and management continue to ask ourselves if there was anything more we could have done. There is an ever-present pain of knowing the impact this has had on the family.
I can't even begin to describe the unbearable weight and emptiness that threatens to consume me and my children. He was the very foundation that our family was built on. Just having him around was a source of strength and comfort to us. We miss the warmth of his hugs. Not having him around anymore has thrown us into darkness. There's nothing but cold and unforgiving emptiness now. My eldest has had to take over as the head of the household, running our finances and appointments in place of my husband. No time to be sad, no time to mourn the loss of childhood. Each sporting success, life milestone is colored with sorrow because their father is no longer with them. We can never outrun the shadow of grief that looms over us like a storm cloud. We cling to memories of him and pray each night into the darkness, hoping he will hear us and return, but only silence greets us. It's such a cruel reminder of the emptiness that now fills our lives. We live in a maze of despair and grief. Every day is a battle, a struggle to find meaning in a world that no longer makes sense.
This family's lives have been forever altered by these tragic events. All that's left is a profound sense of heartache and longing for the life they once knew as they struggle to come to terms with their loss. This case demonstrates that unless safety in the workplace is ensured, not only by employers, senior management and supervisors, but by the workers themselves, there can be terrible consequences because of failure to follow even the simplest and clearest of safety rules.
After the incident, I began experiencing a great deal of psychological trauma, stress, anxiety, shame, panic attacks. Couldn't sleep. How could this have happened? Tried everything. Counsellors, doctors, psychologists. I needed to find a way to cope and get the right treatment. The trauma of the investigation, losing my forklift licence and not knowing if I'd lose my job. The court appearances and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. It's all been overwhelming.
In June 2022, Mr. was charged with manslaughter under the New South Wales Crimes Act, carrying a maximum penalty of 25 years imprisonment.
Mr. Why did you not follow the defined safety process that day? Had you failed to follow procedure on other occasions?
We've been in business up until that stage for 33, 34 years without a notable incident. We thought that we had everything covered. It was simple business, not a lot of heavy machinery, some forklifts, some trucks, and people doing the job for 20 plus years, managers with lots of experience. Our average age of tenure is 18 to 19 years of our senior management team. So there's a lot of experience. And so when it happened, it was almost like, it was my first day back from Christmas holidays. My first day back. And I got the phone and Michael was ringing me. I was in a meeting and he kept ringing me. I go, what does he want? I'm in a meeting, I'll call him back. And somebody came and interrupted the meeting. And it was just oh my God, Like all that time thinking that, you know, we've got this covered. We're doing the right things by our people. And then for that to happen, I guess the aha moment was we need to do more. We just can't rest on our laurels thinking that, look at our track record. We need to do more. We need to invest more. We need to focus more. And we need to improve. It's changed. The last 3 years, it's completely changed our focus and our investment in making sure that our people go home.
It all started as such a normal day, such an average day. The bustling morning routine, the boring drive to work. Homes and livelihoods changed forever. Cutting corners, ignoring process, costs everyone. Don't risk it.
Okay, hand over to Keenan, and Keenan's going to start going through WHS law.
Thank you very much. And I think before jumping into the law, it's worth reflecting on the hidden, or I suppose the unseen costs of all of these incidents. Obviously, there are prosecutions. Obviously, there are financial costs, but I think that video really shows the intense personal cost that affects everyone involved in a workplace incident. Before I go into the world of work health safety law, I thought it would be worthwhile having a look at what this actual presentation is part of. Because what it is, it's part of an enforceable undertaking. So enforceable undertaking is one of a number of options that anyone can consider if they're charged with an offence under the WHS Act. You may choose to plead guilty to the offence, and that is a quicker option, and quite often there will be a discount depending on what state or territory you're in for that early guilty plea. Another option is you can defend the charges and take it through the court system. More expensive, but in some circumstances that might be the choice. But in this context, John Cook and Sons, who, as we heard, was charged with an offence, a breach of their primary duty, section 19, as a category 2 offence. And we'll talk a little bit later about what a category 2 offence is. They were charged with an offence, and rather than going through those two options, they chose to do an enforceable undertaking, which is basically an agreement between the person charged and SafeWork New South Wales, or whoever the regulator is where you're dealing with the charges, to do a certain amount of things in exchange for having the charges dropped. And it's important to know that the things you need to do have to be significantly higher than whatever the penalty would have been had you gone through the court process. So certainly enforceable undertakings are not the easy option. They are quite comprehensive. But what it does provide is an avenue for some good to come out of incidents like this. And you'll hear a little bit later about some of the other things that John Cook and the ITI group have done as part of this EU to deliver benefits to the three key target areas of an enforceable undertaking: the workplace, industry, and the broader community. Now, before we jump into the world of WHS law, it's worthwhile looking at what is the big picture framework, because what you've got is a hierarchy of different obligations. At the very top, you've got the Act, and the Act sets out the key duties that are applicable to everyone in an organisation and workplace. And that's important. We'll talk about that more, because everyone at a workplace has duties. You then go further down, and you've got the regulations. So the regulations add meat to the bones. The regulations identify key areas, key issues that have been identified by the regulator and Parliament that require additional regulation. Think of things like high-risk work, exposure to asbestos, heavy machinery. Then you go further down, you've got the codes of practice and Australian standards. Importantly, and we'll talk about this, in New South Wales, the codes of practice are now actually binding unless you can show that there is an equivalent or safer way of doing something. You go further down, you've got industry standards. So in this case, people like the good people at NTHA are able to share industry knowledge, publish guidance. Of course, through sharing that knowledge within your industry, you're all addressing the key issues that might be arising in your operations. And then finally, you've got your own internal company policies and procedures. Of course, the hope is that all of it is informed going further up the hierarchy until you go back to the original starting point, which is the key duties that are applicable to everyone at a workplace. With that in mind, let's just have a think about what are the key duties, because it's clearly broken down. You've got the PCBU, which is basically just fancy WHS talk for the company. PCBU is person conducting business or undertaking. So the company has a duty, a primary duty, which effectively is to implement and put in place reasonably practicable controls to address risk to health and safety. Then you've got the leaders or officers of the company. Their responsibility is to, as you see here, exercise due diligence. And we'll look into that in depth later. Then you've got everyone else at the company, i.e. workers, who they have a responsibility to take reasonable care. And again, we'll look into that, what that looks like in a few minutes. And importantly as well, the definition of worker under the WHS Act is extremely broad. It doesn't just capture your employees, it could capture contractors that are under your control. And in fact, even if you don't have that, there's a third category, which is for everyone else who doesn't happen to be captured under the WHS Act definition of worker. Everyone else at a workplace has a duty to take reasonable care as well. So what we see here is everyone at a workplace is captured under the WHS Act with some form of duty. Now, with that in mind, it's at this point that we should probably have a think about the penalties. As I said earlier, John Cook and Sons was charged with a Category 2 breach. So we'll just have a look here. You'll see this is a table of the 3 categories of penalty, and you've got up the very top Category 1 breach. So Category 1 breach is the most serious form of breach. I'm not going to address industrial manslaughter until later, because I think that's its own separate kettle of fish. But you've got the Category 1 breach, which basically requires you to have a duty to fail without reasonable excuse to engage in conduct that exposes an individual to a risk of death or serious injury, and for that conduct to be engaged in with gross negligence or recklessness. So it requires an additional level of culpability or knowledge that what you were doing was wrong. That's the most serious offence, and as you can see, you've got a maximum penalty of over $11 million for companies. For officers, over $2 million and or 10 years imprisonment. And then for workers, $1,100,000 and or 10 years imprisonment. So these are significant penalties. But the overwhelming majority of cases that we deal with are Category 2 offences. So it's just the tier below. I think it's worthwhile there reflecting on the wording of the Category 2 breach, because what it is you have a duty, you fail to comply with the duty, and that failure exposes any individual to a risk of death or serious injury or illness. Importantly, the wording is exposes them to a risk. So you don't actually need an actual incident or actual harm necessarily to occur. You don't actually need an injury to occur. And we've seen instances which would be relevant for the timber and hardware industry where pallets have fallen in a warehouse and there was no one present for the pallets to harm. But because an investigation has shown that there weren't exclusion zones in place and because there weren't controls in place, there was still the risk that a person would be within the vicinity of those falling pallets. It was therefore a breach of the Act and a prosecution ensued. So the important message here is the penalties are significantly raising every year. They're indexed to CPI. So next year, 31 July, they'll go up again. And the penalties are increasing at a high rate every year. Now, With that in mind, I think it's important to think about as well the key concepts that inform the WHS Act, which I've got up on the slide here. First and foremostly, the duties are overlapping. Just because one person has duties doesn't mean that that diminishes or wears off any of your responsibilities. They overlap. And in fact, the WHS Act identifies specifically that companies have a duty to consult, cooperate and coordinate with duty holders where there is an overlap between the duties. They're not transferable. I can't agree with someone and say, I transfer all of my duties to you and wash my hands of it. That's not worth, if you put it on paper, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. And in fact, I'll go a step further than that. There's been recent law reform across the country. So now it's even illegal to enter into an insurance contract against penalties under the WHS Act. So when we go through this presentation and we have a look at some of the cases, bear in mind, you must pay a penalty for a breach of the WHS Act out of your own pocket. Not even your own company will pay you out for that penalty. It must be paid by yourself. And then finally, tying in, the duties are concurrent. So you can absolutely have multiple duty holders holding duties with respect to a same issue. But with that in mind, we'll start by having a look at what the worker duty looks like. Now, in this particular case, for the worker duty, we've had a look at the case law. We've had a look at what all of the judgments have to say, and we've identified that there are 6 key elements that workers should be thinking about to discharge their duty to take reasonable care. So firstly, they need to know. They need to know what their legal rights are and what their obligations are as a worker. And following off from that, they need to learn. So they need to actively participate in the training that's been provided to them. And in doing that, making sure that they acquire the necessary skills and instructions to safely operate as a worker in the workplace. Excellent. They need to engage. So they need to engage with the company on health and safety matters. Active engagement is important. And part of that is recognising the importance of consultation in workplaces. So making sure you have active engagement with your workers in consultation with things like risk assessments is so important to getting a positive outcome through that process. Fourthly, reporting. I'm going to talk later about this, but I think this is the critical link between the worker duty and the officer duty. Because one of the elements of the officer duty is to monitor data, monitor reporting coming in. But for that to be accurate and for that to work properly, you need to have your workers reporting incidents on the ground. So one of the things that we've seen as we've travelled on this roadshow now for about 2 months is there's a general agreement amongst people that join us that culture is so important. And I think a key aspect of that is promoting a healthy reporting culture in your organisation where people are not just reporting the incidents they see, the actual incidents, the injuries, but also promoting the reporting of near misses. Because in many cases, it's the near misses that can offer just as much information to prevent a terrible incident from happening in the future than investigating an actual incident after it happens. And I think in that respect, what we see, and this is again tying into the officer duty, is there will often be a huge gap when we investigate incidents between what officers think is happening on the ground versus what is actually happening on the ground. Safety practitioners in this space call it the gap between workers done versus workers imagined. And so that is why reporting is so important and promoting it amongst your workplace is so important. Fifthly, comply. They need to comply with the lawful instructions given to them by their employers. And finally, verify. So, and this ties into the culture point as well. We all as workers in a workplace shouldn't be passive bystanders in promoting safety. We should all take it personally and take it responsibly. And part of that is us as workers verifying that the places we work in are safe to work in. The final point I'll make on the worker duty is, whilst we have identified those 6 factors, it's not set in stone. Meaning of reasonable care is developed over time through case law. And what that also means, and what we've seen in the case law, is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach for the worker duty. And what will be seen as reasonable care will vary massively depending on whether you're dealing with, for example, a first-year apprentice, where arguably what is reasonable care would be a lower threshold, versus someone who's up the top of an organisation, such as a senior manager or officer. So it's important to keep that in mind when you think about reasonable care, that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that it will depend on the nature of the position of the worker that they're dealing with. Now, with that in mind, we're going to look now at the officer duty. So those 6 elements I spoke about before, they were guidance based on our interpretation of the case law. The 6 elements you see on the screen right now, they are an exact copy out of section 27 of the WHS Act. So these 6 elements are set in black and white in stone. So this isn't our interpretation. This is exactly what Parliament has said officer due diligence involves. And it's important, before I even jump into explaining what due diligence is, to say the way that due diligence has been drafted, it is a matter that you must fulfill all of the 6 elements on the screen. It's not a matter of you can go to court after your charge and say, oh, well, I'm sorry, Your Honour, I did 5 out of the 6. I did a good job. That's not going to cut it. The way it's drafted, if you fail one element, you fail all of due diligence. So what this requires is for companies and officers to take a systematic approach to dealing with due diligence, to make sure that they are touching on each of the 6 elements in the under due diligence. So what are the 6 elements? You've got the first element, which is to know. So it requires officers to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. Attending this call is a very important aspect of it. But think about, for any of the officers on the call, what are you doing to keep in touch with the developments of the legal obligations and changing requirements in your space? Is there some sort of an internal newsletter that's circulated? Do you get briefings on a regular basis? That's the first element. The second element is to understand. What understanding requires is officers to gain an understanding of the nature of the operations of their business, and generally the hazards and risks associated with the operations. That's the second element. The third element, resource. That requires the officer to ensure that the company has appropriate resources and processes in place to address and eliminate or minimise risk to health and safety. So for resourcing, it's also not just about the financial side of things, making sure that the cash is in place to deal with it, but it's also thinking about it broader than that and thinking, well, what about other things like the human resourcing side of things? Do we have enough people? Do we have the right people on the right job? That's resourcing. Monitor. As I spoke with the worker duty, this is the tie-in with the worker duty. Monitoring. So whilst the workers need to report, the officers need to be monitoring the reporting coming through. And this is not just a passive process where you should just be looking at the data that's coming through and just tick and flick. What really is required is for the officers to take a critical lens on the data that's coming through. As workplace health and safety lawyer, one of the things that we will often see coming in after an incident is when you're looking at some of the data, particularly injury rates, one of the big red flags that you are going to have a terrible incident is a low injury rate in the organisation. Because whilst on one hand, that might be a good sign, quite often what we will see is it is a sign that your people are under-reporting. So not just monitoring, but monitoring critically and thinking about the sort of data, and we'll talk about the data streams a little bit later, about what you should be thinking about in the organisation. Comply. This basically just requires the company to have in place processes to ensure it remains compliant with the evolving legal landscape. And absolutely, we're seeing the last couple of years across this country, it's an evolving landscape in terms of our obligations. Parliaments have been passing new duties, new requirements, and this effectively requires, ultimately the best way to achieve it is to engage a legal compliance audit to review your system, your safety systems, against the requirements as by law under the WHS Act. And then finally, tying it all together, you've got verify. That's the final element. And what verify requires is the officer to personally and proactively check that all of the systems and processes we've spoken about in those elements are working as intended. What it does not require, importantly, is for the officer to go with a microscope and check every single aspect of the operation. That is not the requirement. But what verify does require is for the officer to make sure there is a system in place in the organisation that touches on those elements, and that system is working as intended, it's being resourced properly, there's appropriate monitoring, and that it is functioning in a way that does achieve successful safety outcomes. So we'll do a little bit of a deep dive on each of the elements. First element, no. As I said, dialing on the call is an important first step. But what we'll have a quick look at is what are some of the key developments. And in that respect, I think the main development that we can say, well, there's a couple, and we'll go into psychosocial hazards in a second, which is, I think, the major development in the WHS space of the last 5 years. But what I will also say before jumping into that is the other major development we're seeing is substantially heightened penalties. The penalties on the books at the moment are increasing. We've seen it in New South Wales. There was an amendment last year which came into effect, which significantly raised the penalties for all breaches of the Act. But what we're also seeing is that the penalties being handed down in courts, so not just the maximum penalties, but the penalties handed down in courts are significantly raising as well. But on to, before we do psychosocial hazards, I'll just quickly touch on recent amendments to the WHS Act in New South Wales, because a few months ago, there was a significant bill with changes to the WHS Act passed. These are, I think, the three most important changes that we can identify. So firstly, health and safety representative requirements have been changed. I won't go too much into the details of it, safe to say that there is a new requirement for companies to provide a copy of any provisional improvement notices to the regulator. But as well, there's also been changes to the dispute resolution mechanisms under the WHS Act. So now what we're seeing under this reform is if there is a dispute over a WHS matter, and that can involve your health safety representative, a trade union, there is now the option to take that dispute to the Industrial Relations Commission and for the Industrial Relations Commission to arbitrate that dispute and issue a binding decision on all the parties in relation to it. So that is a significant change where previously you could seek the advice of a regulator, but that advice would not be binding. You can now seek a binding decision through the Industrial Relations Commission. As I touched on, codes of practice are now becoming legally binding. This is a New South Wales thing, but what it basically says is if there's a code of practice that is applicable, if you are wanting to do something that deviates from the code of practice, you need to be able to show that it provides an equivalent or greater level of safety than the code of practice in effect. And then finally, and this is an interesting change as well, is the limitation period for bringing offences is being tweaked. So historically, there's been a 2-year window to bring WHS offences. And once that 2-year window, after the regulator in New South Wales, SafeWork New South Wales finds out, after that 2-year window, they couldn't bring charges. What we've seen with this amendment is that the regulator can now seek leave from the industrial court to bring proceedings out of this 2-year window. We haven't seen it tested yet, so it remains to be seen how the courts will interpret this additional window outside of the 2-year period. But safe to say, you cannot take the 2-year window after an incident as being completely concrete, and that once you hit that 2-year window, you cannot be 100% certain that that is the total end of the matter, which is a change from the status quo. Now, I think the key takeaway that we have certainly obtained on this roadshow is that psychosocial hazards is not just from our angle, the key focus of regulators, but certainly amongst the timber and hardware industry, psychosocial hazards is the key emerging issue that they need to deal with. And it's no surprise. Regulators across the country in their strategies have identified psychosocial hazards as the key issue that they're looking at in terms of enforcement and compliance. But I suppose the question for people on the call who haven't heard of a psychosocial hazard before is, what is a psychosocial hazard? And you'll see on the slide, we've got examples of psychosocial hazards taken out of the SafeWork Code of Practice. And what you'll see is it is extremely broad and encompassing in terms of what actually is a psychosocial hazard. It can go anywhere from your job demands, the layout of your workplace, poor organisational justice, even violence and aggression could potentially be captured as a psychosocial hazard. But fundamentally what it relates to is issues in the workplace that have the potential to cause psychological harm. And certainly SafeWork New South Wales has been addressing it as an issue. In fact, one of the things that we've seen on the roadshow is they have been visiting workplaces and conducting compliance visits, which to be honest, I wasn't hugely surprised by because it has been identified in their psychosocial strategy. But certainly the message we have taken from the roadshow is SafeWork is out there and they're looking at processes and procedures. And frankly, I think that's a good thing because it's an emerging space. Companies are still understanding how to deal with it. And so what we'll do now is we'll just have a quick little look at what are some of the things that companies have been doing to deal with psychosocial hazards. Because in that respect, the one thing that we're seeing is processes and systems are so important. It's not just having processes and systems that pay lip service, but also thinking about those processes and systems and making sure they work as intended. Whilst we haven't seen a prosecution in New South Wales yet that goes all the way to a conviction for an expressly psychosocial hazard matter, what we have seen is quite a few in Victoria. And I think in particular of one case where it was dealing with a cafe and a barista was being sexually harassed. The barista went to complain about the sexual harassment using the company's internal complaints procedure, but there was just one problem. The complaints procedure led the complaint directly to the perpetrator of the sexual harassment, thereby rendering the entire process obsolete. And that company was actually prosecuted and fined for a breach of, in this case, the WHS Act in Victoria. Another case that I think would be very useful, just to put in context some of the issues that you might see in the timber and hardware industry, is in Victoria, we've seen a prosecution of a company quite recently where an apprentice was chained up and chained onto a chain, lifted up in a yard. Co-workers were throwing stuff, hurling insults at him. And in fact, another co-worker decided to film the incident, which subsequently went viral on YouTube and became the basis of a WorkSafe investigation. So in this case, the company was prosecuted for a breach of the WHS Act, and it was again fined a relatively large penalty. And the last point just on psychosocial hazards before we jump in is we're seeing across the country, except for Victoria, express regulations inserted into the WHS regulations to require companies to deal with psychosocial hazards. So if it's not clear based upon the strategies, it's clear based upon the regulations. This is an issue that needs to be actively addressed by companies. Secondly, understanding. As we said earlier, that's requiring officers to understand generally the nature of the hazards and risks. It's basically having the ear to the wall to know what are the issues happening in your organisation. We've got some tips on how to discharge it here, but I think it's about understanding where the work is being performed, the nature of the work, the kinds of people that are being involved, and I think particularly relevant for the timber and hardware industry, understanding the nature of the overlapping duty holders. So particularly, I know some people on this call might have interaction with members of the public through stores that public people can walk in. That's a thing you need to think about. It's interactions as well with your suppliers, delivery drivers, identifying the areas of overlap and how you need to navigate those overlapping duties between people. Resourcing. As we said, that requires to think not just about the financial resources, but also the non-financial resources, making sure it's all in place and working as intended. Monitoring. So building on what I said earlier, I think you need to think not just about the data that's coming in about incidents, but one of the important things as well is think about having what are some positive performance indicators that you can incorporate that shows not just what's going wrong, because that's one side of the coin. Injury rates tell you what's going wrong, but you should also think about what are some other performance indicators that you can add that show things are going right, positive performance indicators. And again, we've heard some great ideas on the roadshow, anything from including safety observations of officers as a performance measure, to show that the officers are on the ground checking things to one of the interesting things that we've heard on this roadshow is at a couple of workplaces is the use of a green, yellow, red card system and using those systems to, one, encourage a positive safety culture within your organisation, but two, to show examples in your reporting that things are going right in the organisation with respect to safety. Comply. So compliance, again, is a requirement to look at the obligations and make sure that your organisation is complying with it. The ultimate gold standard for that is a legal compliance audit to review your systems. Now, before we get to verify, I think this case is a very good example to talk about what the nature of the duty, the officer duty is like. This case involved a gentleman who was a director who was effectively at the tail end of his career. He was in the twilight years and he had clocked off in his head that he was a director of the company. His company was called Tunny and it was a recycling business. And one day Tunny was workers for Tunny were opening a shipping container and there was a flatbed of a ute in the shipping container. Trying to remove it, they lost control of the flatbed. The flatbed collided with a worker, causing serious injuries. Now, his company, Tunny, was charged. They were prosecuted, breach of the primary duty, category 2, and they were fined $120,000. But what was interesting was the director, who was in his twilight years of his career, he was charged as well. And when it went to court, there was evidence that this guy was asleep at the wheels. He really had no interest whatsoever in exercising due diligence, and it wasn't even on his radar. And what the court found was ultimately due diligence is not optional. If you have a duty to exercise due diligence as an officer, it is not an optional thing that you can opt in or opt out. You must exercise due diligence. As a result of that, the director, Mr. Waring, was convicted and fined $30,000. That was a little while ago. So imagine if that case happened today, you'd be looking at a higher penalty, which again, he would have had to have paid out of his own personal pocket. And another interesting mythbuster that we've got for WHS law is the nature of WHS law is criminal. So when we say he was convicted, he received a criminal conviction against his name. And so now if he wants to travel overseas, he has to disclose in countries that require it that he has a criminal conviction against his name. So bear in mind as well, this area of the law is absolutely criminal once you're dealing with it in the courts. So then you've got the final element, verify. So this ties everything together and it puts a requirement on the officers to personally and proactively verify that the systems they're required to put in place as part of due diligence are working as intended. You can kind of hit two birds with one stone, as we're talking about before. Safety observations are an important way that officers can do that. And if you have a set requirement for a certain number of safety observations by your officers, that can also become a performance indicator to show a capacity within your company for things to go well. So just something to think about in terms of processes. Now, we'll have a quick reflection on this case, which I think gives people a good example of what verifying looks like in the real world. It's all well and easy for us to talk about verifying in a legal, theoretical way that is kind of sitting in the ivory tower. But this is on the ground, an actual case, an actual prosecution. So this particular case, it was at a construction site where a worker was lifting a metal bar. The work site was near high voltage power lines. Now, unfortunately, the high voltage power lines had not been turned off. No controls had been put in place. And as a result of that, the worker made contact with the high voltage power lines, exposed to a high level of power. He didn't die, but unfortunately his arms were so severely burned by that process that they had to, the medical people had to amputate both of his arms below the elbow. Now in this case, again, the company was charged, prosecuted, but interestingly in this case, one of the directors was also charged and prosecuted. So it went to court. When it went to court, there were a few things identified by the court as to what he should have been doing as an officer. So one of which is he should have verified that his company had implemented adequate resources for the management of health and safety. So in particular for this, there should have been risk assessment processes to identify the power lines, site inspections, and requesting reports from personnel about what's happening on the ground. He should have verified the compliance of the company with the requirements of the Electrical Supply Authority, including undertaking a risk assessment. So again, undertaking a risk assessment which would have identified the power lines and the risk of the electric shock, and most likely would have resulted in those lines being isolated in the first place, going straight up what we call the hierarchy of controls to eliminate the risk from happening in the first place. And then finally, it was identified that he should have ensured that there was a formal process in place for assessing and managing hazards on site. So for this particular for this officer, he was convicted and fined $40,000. He had an early guilty plea. So that was reduced by 25% to $30,000. Again, the case was a little while ago, so we could probably expect if the same thing happened today, it would be a much higher penalty. With all of this talk of jail time and locking up and $1 million penalties, I thought it would be good to end on a positive message. And this case, I think, illustrates the importance of knowing what your duties are and taking it seriously. So it's a very similar case factually to what we've heard about with John Cook and ITI, where it involved a forklift out of control at a workplace colliding with a worker, and that workplace didn't have pedestrian management controls in place. So the company was charged, that went through the courts, and they were convicted and fined $450,000 plus SafeWork's costs. But what's very interesting about this case is separately, the officer of that company, Mr. Doble, was also charged as an officer for failing to discharge his due diligence obligation. But when it went to court and evidence was put forward, amongst other things, what the message that came clear through that process was that Mr. Doble, as an officer, was a hands-on director. And Mr. Doble did, in fact, do the 6 elements and discharged those 6 elements. And because of that, whilst we have on one hand a company being convicted and fined and ordered to pay costs, we have on the other hand here an officer who was acquitted of the charge, which meant that there was no charge in the end against him and he successfully defended the charge. So what this case really shows is, and we can apply this much broader than just officer duties and say for all duties, it's a double-edged sword, because while on one hand, yes, the obligation is on you and you can't contract out. You are required to discharge that. The other side of that sword is if you understand what your duties are and you know what you need to do to discharge it, and you do everything within your power to discharge your duty, you are setting yourself up for success so that you don't end up in a situation where you're prosecuted, convicted, and facing these charges in the first place. So the key message I think to take out of all of this is knowledge is power. And by empowering all of your people in an organisation to know that they have duties, whilst on one hand, yes, it's obviously good for the company and for safety outcomes that everyone takes their duties seriously, it's ultimately in everyone's interest to know what it is and discharge those duties. Because if you don't do it, you are potentially exposing yourself to a risk of a prosecution under the WHS Act. So with all things said and done, the final observations that we would make would be the officer due diligence duty is personal and proactive. It requires active involvement. And I'll go a step further than that and say all of the duties that duty holders have in a workplace are personal and need to be understood and need to be discharged. And again, I think that's a key message that everyone should take to their people at the end of this webinar. For officers, you need to think systematically about the 6 elements of due diligence. It's a requirement that you follow each of those 6 elements systematically. So when you think about it, think, how am I collecting evidence and what am I doing to show that I'm discharging each of those 6 elements independently? We touched on it, personal and proactive. In terms of the key issue for regulators, it's psychosocial hazards. So think about what you've got in place to deal with psychosocial hazards. And if you're not sure, think about using resources like the NTHA or other potential resources to assist you in building those systems and processes and identifying what are the unique psychosocial hazards associated with your operations, because it will be different depending on the workplace. I only briefly touched on this, but keep in the back of your heads with everything you heard, we have seen a huge change in terms of industrial manslaughter in this country. Every state and territory now has an industrial manslaughter offence. And what you're looking at, I've got up there the New South Wales penalties, but I will say nationally, some jurisdictions have life imprisonment as a maximum penalty and over $20 million in penalties. So that again raises the spectre and raises the potential consequences of a breach of the WHS Act to an entirely unprecedented level. And finally, if it's not enough that what is on the books is increasing, what we're seeing is that the penalties that are being handed down by courts is also increasing. But with all that said and done, I think the key message everyone should take is that these duties are ultimately not just put in place for the fun of it, but they're put in place to build safe workplaces. And so by sharing the knowledge of these duties and obligations, we're not just doing it for the fun of it, but we're ultimately doing it to prevent the sorts of incidents like we're talking about today from ever happening in the first place. We'll move on now to hear about some of the stuff that John Cook have done.
Just before we get into our key learnings, just if you've got any questions, if you want to start shooting them through to Vicky, and we'll start addressing them all at the end. So some of the things that we learned over our journey arising from the accident is that firstly, we had to look at things differently. I'd been with this business for about 12 months. And we had a traffic management plan in place that was working, but didn't necessarily mean it was the best traffic management plan. So one of the things that we had to do was we had to look at separating people and plant. So we ripped our traffic management plan apart about 4 or 5 times until we come up with a plan that we're operating under today, where it really separates people and plant. We reviewed all of our SWPs, and those that were still relevant, we rolled out to our team again, and that was hundreds of hours worth of training hours that we implemented. For those that weren't relevant, we went back and adjusted our SWPs and then started rolling out those to our team. and then implemented some other ones that we realised after doing an audit that we had missing from our processes. We employed Steve, a national safety manager. Prior to then, safety was responsible, the responsibility sat with each of the branch managers. And then bringing Steve on actually gave us some framework and guidelines. We explored some additional technology, and we're going to show two pieces of technology that we looked at and we're currently utilising, and we'll share that with you in a minute. We invested in signage just to reinforce the message of the changes and so forth that we had throughout our yard and how we operate. Introduced new safety management systems, which was basically the framework of how we deliver everything now. And obviously, right at the end of it, we engaged an external auditor, which is just our security to come in and double check to make sure that we're on track and we're delivering our obligation. So this is one of the pieces of technology that we've engaged with, Inviol. It's a New Zealand-based company. It's a system that plugs into your CCTV. And on your screen, you'll see that there's two red boxes, a red box placed around the pedestrian or the truck driver, and a red box placed around the forklift. And then obviously there's a red box placed around the entire scene. So we've got about 84, 86 cameras, and we've got this system on 9 of our cameras. And the reason why we've only got them under 9 of our cameras is whatever's happening under those 9 cameras is happening under all 84 cameras. And it's basically an AI system. So you put some work parameters in and you say, well, if you're seeing a pedestrian within a 3 metre or 4 metre zone of a forklift, well, then it's something that needs to be registered and recorded. And it's important to note that it's a coaching tool. It's not a performance management tool, and it's not to replace supervision. So it's to help drive that culture, that safety culture that we were talking about before. So what happens is that this goes into a bit of a risk register. It captures the footage. It sends you an email at the end of the day or the next day to say this is the days before's incidents, and it rates them for you to low, medium and high. And then you go in, you review these systems, and then you can start conducting toolbox talks and closing them off. So we've had this system in place now operating well for just over 4 weeks. It's not been very long, and we've already seen a 30% reduction in reportable notifications coming through on email. So, just in that short period, we're seeing a dramatic reduction. And this will just play a little video, and you'll notice in the video that the screen will go red. And effectively, all this is telling us in this particular area is that we have a designated speed zone set, and we've set the parameters, and it's worked out the time that the forklift travelled through that parameter zone, that the forklift was actually breaching the agreed speed in that area. So again, that would just go into the risk register and how you decide them to be prioritised. So that would probably come through as a medium risk, and then you start using it as a coaching tool again. So one of the other systems we looked at is Litum. It's an RTLS system. It's a Turkish-based company, and there's many layers to this system. So the system that we've gone with is like a mesh network system. So effectively, you've got these gateways or anchors that we install on the top of the cages of the forklift, and it sets out proximity. I don't know how you describe it, but basically puts out all these waves, and it gets picked up by the other machine. And you can actually set the distances. It's fully programmable. And for example, for us, so anything that's considered a safe zone is 8 metres plus away from each other. So that's 2 forklifts operating exceeding 8 metres. And if you're in a caution zone, it's between 3 metre and 8 metre. And if you're in the danger zone, it's sub 3 metres. So what happens is it'll send through an auditable tone to the forklift and a light system. So an amber light will come on if you're in the caution zone, and a low level auditable tone. If you're in the red zone, danger zone, it'll be a much higher auditable tone and a red light comes on. With 5 of our forklifts, it actually also controls the speed. So our forklifts are speed limited to 10 kilometres an hour. In the caution zone, it drops them to 4.6, and in the danger zone, it drops them to 1.6. It's also important to note that when the forklift driver hops off the forklift, So all our guys in the yard, they actually wear a device on their wrist about the size of a smartwatch. So when they hop off a forklift, they then become a pedestrian. It takes about 20 seconds for the system to realise that they're no longer part of that forklift and they become a pedestrian. When they hop back on the forklift, they just follow the startup procedure for the forklift, and then the system recognises them back in the forklift again. So the system that we had is, or that we have is, what, as I said, like a mesh network system. So we've got these gateways and anchors installed all over the yard and the roof of our shed, or the ceiling of our shed. And what that allows us to do is create some hotspot mapping or some reporting. So it'll look at your interactions between your people and your people and your plant and your plant and your plant. And you know, the image we got on the screen there shows the red zone. So obviously, if you want to start looking at risk and risk assessments within your business, and we're all pretty sure we know where they are, but I'll be surprised when we did this, we actually found a couple of areas that we weren't 100% aware of that we've actually now gone back to address as a high risk area and put some different traffic management in place. Very similar system between person and plant, or between pedestrian and forklift. As I said, so our guys in the yard, they all wear something about the size of a smartwatch. If you're a visitor through the yard, you get given a lanyard. Same sort of thing, except for it being an audible tone, it'll actually vibrate. So the person, the pedestrian actually gets a vibration of the alert, but the forklift still gets the same alert that it's forklift to forklift, and slows the forklift down if you're within that danger zone. So they're the two big pieces of technology that we've implemented and we think is really working well. They work well separately, but they also work well together. So the other thing that we're pretty proud of is that we've actually developed an app, and it's important to note from our point of view that this app is not a be-all, end-all to replace anything. A lot of businesses that we've been talking to over the last 2 months, I've got a lot of fantastic stuff in place. So this app is really just a pressure test, I guess, some of what you've got in place and helpfully fill some gaps that you may not have in place. So it's a pretty simple system. Firstly, and we'll go through what the content of the app is shortly, but pretty simple. You download the DS site app off either the Google Play or the App Store, and that's a host app, a host platform. Then scan the QR code, so register for DS, scan the QR code, that'll then put you into the NTHA app. And this is what the app looks like. So on the left-hand side, you'll actually see the NTHA, the logo. The app has the video on it that we saw before, and there's a whole heap of green tabs that you can go through. So it's important to note again that this is customizable to your business. So if you scroll right to the very bottom of the app, you've got the sign up to DS site, which then looks like that form on the right-hand side. You fill that form out, submit it to DS, 24 to 48 hours. They'll actually set your business up. So when you go to log in this next time, it actually won't be the NTHA app, it'll be your business's app, whatever you've registered as your company name when you send it through, and then you can upload your logos and so forth to it. Excuse me. So instead of going into the homepage, as you can see up there on the far right, where it's the DS and the NTHA, that's where it'll actually come up your screen or your business app. So one of the things that we learnt when we went through our journey is when SafeWork turned up, the first thing that they started asking us for was all this reference material that we'd been using and everything that we'd had on file. And one thing that we found is that we had a lot of stuff printed and put in folders. But the moment we went and grabbed it and started producing it and showing it to either the SafeWork or the police or something, is that this stuff could have been 2, 4, 6 years out of date. So whilst we had reference material and had been referencing this material, we did find out that it was out of date. So the top tab is your legal responsibilities. It goes across into a break up by state. So it is broken up by state, and this will be changing a little bit over time, because as it gets updated, this will be updated. But more importantly, you just go into whatever state it is that you're in, and you go through and look at the Act and so forth. It's also important to note that under the base of New South Wales, this presentation is also available within the app, but Vicky will also be sending it out through NTHA afterwards. There's a gap analysis tool. So one of the things that we've been asked, and one of the things that we thought about, is where do you start? Do you know where your gaps are? So we sat down, and this is probably one of the hardest things that we've actually put together. And there's a heap of questions in here about obligations and requirements. So basically, if you just go through and answer all of these questions as best you possibly can with the knowledge you have, it'll actually go into a risk register, and it'll shoot you back a bit of an action plan of, hey, these are your gaps in your business. And depending on how far you are in your journey of setting up your OH&S systems, to how big this information or this action plan comes back to you as. It's important to note that just start somewhere. So, for some people that we've had discussions with, this could be a massive shopping list of to do, or it could be just a short list. It's just important to, I guess, complete the gap analysis and start somewhere. One of the things that we learned, and really we found out when we received our charges back from SafeWork, is that the reference material that we were using for our SafeWork procedures were very much state-based. So one of the things that SafeWork referenced was the fact that we didn't chock our wheels on the forklift. And we went through all the material that we had available to us, and the only place we found chocking of wheels available was actually in the national act, not the state act. So we've gone and, based on that, developed now a training video and a sign-off sheet. So that training video covers off chocking of wheels and correct parking of forklift, and etc. Because, as I said, the one thing that we found is it's very different depending on what tools and data and so forth you're referencing. At the bottom of that, once you scroll down, and it's a bit hard to demonstrate it in this platform, but once you scroll down, there's a lot more reference material at the bottom as well. So same with your WHS site procedures. We've just got some basic tools in here around traffic management, contractor induction, pre-starts, toolbox talks. Again, just use these as reference material. Check to see what it is that you've got in play, and you might just close some little gaps. Jumping around a little bit here, so just health and wellbeing. Keenan was talking about the psychosocial. So we've got some, again, reference points and some little tools here just to help you look at the psychosocial and what you're offering in your businesses. It was a surprise to us that, when we're doing these road shows, that we found out that SafeWork had dropped in and door knocked on businesses randomly and just said, hey, what have you got in place in this space? So again, this could just help you put some of that in place. The last piece I'm really going to go through within the app, it's a little bit harder to talk about, so we're not going to demonstrate it, but it's Smartsheet. And what we'll do is, through Vicky, we'll actually set up another time or expression of interest. If people are interested in going through how to use this section, we'll set up another session time so we can explain Smartsheet in detail. But basically what it is, you register for Smartsheet. For a single admin operator, it's free. For multiple admin operators, there is a charge. So you set yourself up or someone up in your business as an admin operator, and then other people can use and populate the sheets. It's only if they have admin controls to adjust the sheets that then you need to start paying. So what happens? Set yourself up, go in, save these templates as your own. Once you save them, once you go in to click on them to use them, it'll actually say, hey, you need access. Request access, and apologies, but you do need to do that on every form. Once you request access, Steve will grant the permission, then you can get in and start playing with and using these forms. There's a heap of forms, goes into a heap of registers. Again, go back to our experience that we had in 1st of February 21. When we got asked to supply all of this information, we couldn't easily access everything in one location. This system, very much a cloud-based system, can upload all of your supporting documentation, whether it be through your contractor compliance with insurance certificates, driver's licenses, hot work permits, etc. It stores everything in one location, so it makes it very easy to use. And again, just reiterate, if you're interested, message Vicky and we'll set up a session.
First question on, can it be used on desktop and PC?
Yeah, 100% it can be used on desktop and PC. So the way the system actually is designed is so it can be used in like the yard operations, etc. So whether you're out there doing site assessments, you can upload photos, or it can be used on desktop. It's very much good for training. So there's QR codes and so forth. So you can generate a QR code and give it to little Johnny who works on your receiving area, and little Johnny can do his OH&S induction, for example, and then every 2 years or every 11 months, 1 year, 11 months, it'll send you a reminder that little Johnny's due to do it again. So, yep, but very much tablet friendly, mobile friendly, PC friendly. So that's all our key takeouts and key learnings from our journey, I guess. That's the suite of tools that we've put together and sharing with everybody. So if you hop on, you download, follow those procedures, play with them, and then any questions, a bit different for this environment, but any questions, come back through Vicky and we'll start addressing them. But I guess the question is now, we're all of...
We got a question about what do you do? Rhonda's asked, what do you do when you can't get the truck driver to stand where you want them to load and unload? Do you stop?
Stop.
What do you do?
Yeah, stop. So the forklift driver, I guess, is the person that's in control. And the forklift driver is the one that will always be in control of the situation. So if you can't get whether it be another worker or a truck driver to do what's required of them, whether it be stand in a designated area or get out of a work zone, then you actually stop the activity until you can actually take control of the matter.
And you want to cover chain of responsibility?
Chain of responsibility. So one of the things that we're looking at in Inviol is, which is that CCTV system, is we're actually going to look at how that can report on chain of responsibility for us. So we've got setting up some work parameters where it'll take the height of the load, the length of the load, and try and tell us whether we have enough or not enough strapping on that truck and actually flag it for us. What it can't do is mid strapping or belly strapping, can't tell us the tension of the strapping, but it can tell us the amount of the strapping. So the chain of responsibility still very much is in the yard, on the job as it's happening. My suggestion would be there is some really good chain of responsibility training out there. Jump on board with them. And if you can do that with the load strapping course, the two work really well hand in hand. Logistics is one of the companies that does it, yes. Any other questions? It's right in my eye coming off that building. No, that's all right. I'll just stand this side.
Okay, so question again is, so if they want it loaded in a certain way and we disagree, who's responsible then?
That's a really good question and a difficult question. I guess the main thing that we've got to realise is ultimately The driver is responsible once they get out onto the road. The driver is the expert, or theoretically should be the expert on how a load should be loaded. It should be done within consultation. However, ultimately, the driver probably has the majority of the say.
How long is the app supported?
So the app is supported for 2 years. So 2 years from the commencement of our EU rollout. So that was the 4th of August, I think it was. Is that our first session, the 4th of August?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 2 years from the 4th of August, the app will be supported. And we're working with NTHA for that app just to continue on thereafter. So, and we're hoping to do a bit of development with the app throughout the next 2 years.
Is the data that's collected, what's...
So legally, we're required to do a bit of a sign off or with SafeWork regarding, regarding our EU. So we capture some click data, but apart from that, nothing else. We don't see what anybody else is doing on the app, who's using the app, apart from click data. So for example, I hopped on the other day and there was over 500 visits to the app, and that's the sort of data that we've just got to provide back to SafeWork. So no other information is taken or stored by us. And the moment that you take it offline to away from the NTHA host app and make it your own app, again, we just see that somebody's moved over and we don't get any click data thereafter.
Can you give us an overview about the forklift driver's charges and that journey?
So in our particular case, our forklift driver was originally charged with manslaughter by the police, and about 6 months after the original charges, he was also charged by SafeWork New South Wales, excuse me, under the Worker Act. What happened throughout that process is that SafeWork kept on deferring through the courts that matter being heard, whilst the police matter was going through the courts. Somewhere through all of that, there was a bit of a plea done between the forklift driver and the police, went through the courts on a lesser charge, pled guilty, got a 2-year home detention, 6-month monitor, loss of motor vehicle licence and cancellation of forklift licence. After those proceedings were finalised, SafeWork then took their matter to the courts, and then he was also found guilty there and had to pay a fine and SafeWork's costs. So effectively, and still don't understand this law to today, but effectively he was charged twice and convicted twice of the same thing. Any other questions from the...
Yes, I've just got one again about where we find the workhouse safety rules for us on the NTHA site. So that'll be a part of the app.
Sorry.
You've done all the state-based rules, legislations.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're going to do is state-based stuff, when you get into the top tab, will be itemised very differently, state-based. And one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next period of time is work with NTHA and see what it is on their platform that can be integrated within the app. So there'll be more information and access to tools and information through the app.
You see the questions on yours? Just not sure. I can come up there
While I am
otherwise.
presenting. So let me stop sharing.
We might lose our screen. Oh, that's all right.
I can't see any questions. Oh, chat, here we go.
That's okay. You can leave it up there. I'll come up and talk from there.
Well,
Do you want to, is someone want to just check in case they get any questions?
okay, very good.
I'll just tell them some next steps. I can see them now. Cool.
Yeah,
That's all good. So if there's any other questions, feel free to put them straight through the app. But I just wanted to let you know that what we're going to do from here. So clearly, we're really appreciative that you joined in today as being part of this discussion. We hope that you're going to take away some great key messages, insights, and naturally some practical tips through the app, and that you can share this back with your workplace, something that you can actually implement. A recording of today's webinar, as I said this morning, along with the slides and resources, will be available. Probably trying to add it to our website next week. And I'll also send a link out to your own inboxes for those that have registered. If you haven't registered, I will put my email address in here, but most of you would have seen that on an email that's come out recently. So it's just vicky.s@ntha.com.au. But I'll put in the chat box before we leave. I also just wanted to touch base, as Michael had suggested, we will run a Teams webinar session, or probably just a team session, specifically on Smartsheet and the app. But I will send to you the actual, so I've got questions around the QR code and how do we actually download it all. I will send you all of that prior, so you can have a little play around with it and then come to that session, which we'll probably try and do in a couple of weeks. Gives you a bit of a chance to have a play. In the meantime, feel free to reach out. We're also going to set up a session with Envial. So we talked a little bit about, for you to be able to gain a deeper understanding on how you might be able to implement that into your own workplace, what the costs will be, what are the sort of risks that it's going to be able to highlight for you and whether it's worthwhile investment or not. So we're going to try and partner with Envial, and they've been very accommodating for that. So we'll set up a session on that as well. If there's something else that you take away from today that you think you need a deeper dive on or more understanding, please reach out, and I'll either put you in touch with who it might be, or if it's with NTHA, then that's what we're here for. We're here to support you. All right. The biggest thing from today, and I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so I don't want to hang on to you unnecessarily, but I'd also like to really encourage you to take away, I guess, and share these takeaways with your teams to really help strengthen the safety and awareness across your workplace. So I know Keenan went right into a bit of a deep dive around workhouse safety. And the feedback we've had so far is, very great practical, down-to-earth tips to try and help you keep safe and understand your due diligence. So if you've got any questions while we have Keenan in the room on the law, now's your chance to ask a question. But either way, we can set up other sessions around that in the future. Ideally, I would love to run a session, and I know that here at Hamilton Log they do run these sessions specifically for directors and PCBUs around understanding the legislation as well.
What do you think this has cost?
Audience, hang on.
What do you think this has cost the business so far, just in the reactives?
So I guess there's two elements of the cost. There was the initial reactive cost from the incident and the changes that we put through the business. And then there's the cost for the EU. So two very distinct breakups, I guess. And so between the two, you're up there close to $2 million.
I know they invested just in the app alone nearly $500,000. So the more users that we can get to take that on board, the better it is for you in your workplace. We know that a lot of our members already have quite a bit in their workplace, but have a look at it. You might find this to be a bit of a cheaper alternative with a lot more tools that are specifically built for our industry. So
we share this beyond our industry?
With whoever. This is not just through NTHA members. This is open to whoever. And I mentioned it before we started this meeting. I had somebody from the food industry reach out to me yesterday. So
yeah, there's been some great feedback from the roadshow. So we know this is why we set up the webinar, because we know we couldn't get to everybody. It was specifically for New South Wales to start with. So that's why we spent a lot of time rural regionally. We have been to Adelaide and ran a roadshow there. We have been to Melbourne. Unfortunately, didn't get as successful as we would like there, but we actually had been, the roadshow had been heard from others outside of our industry, and we had a very successful, I won't know that company's name, but we had a very successful meeting with a completely different industry. So, and the question just before was, can we share this, outside the industry? Absolutely. So, and you're already getting requests for it. So,
Yeah, definitely. And one of the biggest feedbacks I guess we're getting is businesses who have taken just the video back to share that within their operations are getting a dramatic impact and a desired impact, I guess, around behaviour.
so the reason, you know, for this enforceable undertaking and the roadshows is to share it with anybody and everybody who needs help in safety. So if you have colleagues or people that live in your own towns or people that you know don't have potentially what you already have, feel free to share it. So you know, if you want to make this your own app, as Michael sort of agreed, you can put your logo on there. You know, some different parameters, you absolutely can tailor it. If you decide, you know, you've got more than one site and you want to sort of collate it all to one site, there could be a small fee for it. But that's something that you'll have a conversation with them at the time. But overall, the investment that they've put into the app is something that's going to be a benefit to not just our members, but beyond that. Have a quick look to see if I've got any more questions, and if not, then we will probably wrap up for you. We got some. Absolutely, you can show this video because we got some feedback. Thank you. You know, well sad but very informative. I'd love to show this video to my workers. And look, you know, we recommended highly that you do share this presentation, which is why we've done it as a webinar, and especially any forklift drivers. You know, we know that everybody is so busy doing what they're doing, trying to achieve, you know, all the tasks in a day, dealing with customers, dealing with suppliers, loading and unloading trucks, that sometimes it can just be a split-second decision that they didn't do correctly that can lead down this path. So it's a great tool for you to share. There's also other videos on forklift safety within the app. So the guys have put a lot of effort into it. So as I said, we'll set up another one for us, or we can go through any other questions that you have specifically on the app. But with no other questions here, really on behalf of NTHA and our speakers, you know, they have shared some great valued insights with everybody. Thank you again for your time and engagement today, and above all, work safe. Thank you.